Mr. President. When I was on the floor a few moments ago, I mentioned the death yesterday of a great Alaskan, and I would like to take a few moments this afternoon to pay tribute to an amazing Alaskan, an educator, a man who lived a life that many would say was remarkable, and yet I think in his humble words he said he just lived his life and did the best he could. Dr. Sidney Charles Huntington was truly a great Alaskan. He died yesterday at the age of 100 years old in Galena, Alaska, which is up on the Yukon River. Sidney Huntington was a respected Athabascan elder. He was a culture bearer. He was a role model, definitely a role model. He was a mentor to so many, not only in his village, in his region, but in his state. He was a prolific storyteller. He was a philosopher. He had words of wisdom. He was a reservoir of traditional knowledge. He was an outdoorsman who knew and understood and loved and feared the land. He was a businessman. He was truly a public service, particularly when it came to education. And he was a warrior in the fight against youth suicide. These are just some of the words by which we remember one of our state's most treasured cultural icons. Sidney Huntington was known to his family and his friends as Grandpa Sid, and probably for lots of good reasons. He had a lot of grandkids. But there were some many personal stories, and I think as we reflect on 100 years of a great Alaskan, we will begin to share many of these stories and tributes. He was certainly a savvy poker player. That's going to come out. He was a very generous man. We were talking about him just earlier today in my office. He was one of those guys who would truly give the shirt off his back. Sidney once encountered a young Native student who he had thought had gone off to school, had left the village to go off to go to school, and the young man said, "I couldn't go because I need to stay at home. I need to earn some money." And Sidney literally takes out his wallet, and he gave him 8 $100 bills and told him to get to school. That was vintage Sidney. School was important. School had to be a priority. And Sidney wasn't going to let the fact that this young man thought he needed to stay home and make money, literally, take out his wallet. Sidney Huntington was one tough Alaskan. He was a man of really impeccable standards. He told it like it is. He would hold back not one iota. I was in Galena after they had experienced some terrible flooding several years back, and the community had come together to talk about the FEMA response, how that was working with the state. And you had the federal agency reps, you had the state people, and everybody was trying to figure out how we get through a difficult situation. And Sidney Huntington, not sitting in the back of the room, but sitting right up front at that table, he's, by gosh, we've got to get to work. No mincing words about it. He told it like it truly was. He was hardy, he was determined, he was very, very resilient. He was just the real deal. I was very privileged to know Sidney, and I was honored to be called his friend. And that's quite an honor because you didn't choose Sidney to be your friend. Sidney chose you. And he'd identified me as somebody that could not only be helpful, but that he could relate to, that we could have conversation back and forth. It wasn't too many years ago, I flew into Galena, and Galena is a very small village on the Yukon River, as I mentioned, and you fly into the little airport there, and I go to the very small little facility that houses the travelers as they're coming and going, and there's Sidney sitting on a chair right outside the little airport station there. And I asked him, "Where are you going, Sidney?" "I'm sorry, you're not going to be here while I'm here visiting Galena." And he says, No, I'm here because I got some talking to do to you. And he says, "Where are we on some of these education things? Talk to me about No Child Left Behind." So Sidney was like, I'm not going to miss her coming to Galena and perhaps not getting a chance to talk to her. He wasn't leaving. He was parked there to visit. If Sidney Huntington chose to call you a friend, you didn't take it for granted, and you really accepted that gift with great humility. I think about the relationships, the friendships that I have made over the years, and I tell you, nothing can make me, as a third-generation Alaskan, feel more like an Alaskan than knowing that I had earned the respect of Sidney Huntington. Eric Mack, a journalist who worked in Galena, tells the story of how Sidney managed to survive when his snow machine fell through the ice. He was coming back from a trip. He'd been out tending his trap line, and it was cold. It's about 30 degrees below zero. It's at night. It's dark. He's on his snow machine. The snow machine goes through a hole in the ice into a shallow section on the Yukon, and he was a long ways from home. He dragged that snow machine out of the water, out of the icy water by himself. He made a fire from the gasoline and the frozen and some frozen wood that he had, and he kept himself from freezing to death. You know, you think about how you do all that. That's one tough Alaskan here. Sidney Huntington was born in Huslia, which is on the Koyukuk River. He was born back in 1915. He was born to a Scot-Irish father who arrived from New York in 1897. His mother was Athabascan Indian. His mother died when Sidney was about 5 years old, and it left Sidney and two younger siblings to survive in the wilderness for 2 weeks. Now think about this, and I'm going to leave my colleagues with the memory of an exceptional book that Sidney Huntington has written called Shadows on the Koyukuk. But he details in these opening chapters about that situation when he, as the oldest of the three children, at 5 years old, is in a cabin in the middle of the wilderness with his mother, and his mother dies. At 5, he is the only one to care for his two siblings. This is the beginning of, again, a remarkable life for a remarkable man. His father lived off the land as a trapper and a trader. And so the stories that are shared through Sidney's book, again, are just remarkable about what was happening in Alaska in the early 1900s. Sidney and his siblings were sent first to the NVIC mission for schooling, and then he later attended the BIA school at Eklutna. He basically got the equivalent of a third grade education. That was it. That was it for his formal schooling, was third grade. And you need to keep that in mind as I talk about the rest of Sidney's story and his life. When he was 12 years old, he returned to help his father work the trap line and learn the subsistence lifestyle. So he was out in the middle of Alaska. He's out in the wilderness. He is not in school. By age 16, he was earning a living hunting and trapping. And at age 22, he went to go work in a gold mine. In 1963, Sidney moved to Galena to work for the Air Force as a carpenter, and then in the 70s, he went into the fish processing business. So he's been everything here. He's been a gold miner, he's been a carpenter, he's been in fish processing, he's been a hunter and a trapper and a subsistence guy. He is really living the traditional rural life in rural Alaska, sustaining himself and his family through a mixture of subsistence and participation in the cash economy. And many around the state share this life story. But that was just one dimension of Sidney. This guy, who had the equivalent of a third-grade education, served 2 decades on the Alaska boards of Fish and Game. He published a best-selling biography that I just mentioned entitled Shadows on the Koyukuk. He did that back in 1993. In fact, this book that he wrote is so good, is so compelling. It is the book that I take around to the high schools when I go to visit students. I never leave a school visit without leaving something there, and I leave a book for their library. And the book that I have chosen to leave with students all around the state is Shadows on the Koyukuk, because of the amazing accomplishments of this amazing Alaskan. The University of Alaska Fairbanks in 1989 awarded Sidney an honorary doctorate in public service. So here again, a man with a third-grade education, focused on public service, education, helping his community, his state, publishing a best-selling biography. This is an extraordinarily accomplished man. Sidney has participated in oral interviews through the University of Alaska system, which will be extraordinary. It allows, again, for a way to write that living history of Sidney Huntington, an extraordinary self-made individual. He is truly the stuff of which legends are made. And Alaska holds a lot of legends. It's a big state full of some tall stories, but Sidney, once again, is the real deal. His life was a profile of courage and inspiration, and it's not only been chronicled in books and interviews, it was even played out in the theater. There's a stage play, and it's called Winter Bear. And the Winter Bear tells the fictional story of a young Native man who contemplated suicide. And in this play, this young Native man is sentenced to cut wood for Sidney Huntington. And making a pact with Sidney to live, he goes on to construct a traditional bear spear under Sidney's guidance. And that spear is used to bring down this marauding bear. But Sidney is injured in the incident. And the young man, who's very insular and very afraid of public speaking, must now speak for Sidney before thousands of people at the Alaska Federation of Natives Convention. And at this point, the young man finds himself and his voice and recognizes the value of his life and emerges as a leader. And while this play, Winter Bear, may be fictional, Sidney Huntington's experience with suicide is absolutely not. In real life, Sidney lost children to suicide. He grieved for them every day and shared his loss with school children who visited his cabin. He has shared with me, as we have visited in quiet conversations, the loss and the grief that he feels as not only his children, but others in his community and his region have suffered with suicide. Sidney was a champion for young people. He so believed in the future of our young people, urging that they choose life, that they get an education, that they get a good education, and they take pride in their proud heritage. Sidney Huntington was the patriarch of a large and extended family. I know so very many of them, and they're all very accomplished in their own right. He's survived by his wife, Angela. They've been married 72 years. Pretty good marriage there. He's got some 30 children, both biological and adopted, and many, many grandchildren. On May 10th of this year, they gathered in Galena to celebrate the centennial of Sidney's birth, and they all wore T-shirts that bore some of Sidney's words of wisdom, like make life worth living. Work hard, keep up a good spirit, have a good attitude towards others. This will take you a long way in life. These are words to live by and words to remember an Alaskan that was truly larger than life and as large as the great state that he calls home. Mr. President, I was privileged by the gift of the friendship of Sidney Huntington. Alaska is privileged by the gift of this legacy. This man is a true hero of our homeland, and he is now gone, but his life of inspiration will long, long be remembered. So I thank you for the opportunity to again pay tribute to a great Alaskan and to send my condolences and that of the United States Senate to his family, his many extended relatives, and those of us throughout the state who cherish a great Alaskan leader. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.